Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a combination reading wrap-up and travel vlog. I'm currently in a hotel in Guangzhou in China. There's the tower. There's a picture of the tower. And this is going to be a recounting in two parts, I think, of what I read and what I saw while I was in Vietnam and while I was in Cambodia over the past couple of weeks. So to start with, if we're connected on Instagram, you might have noticed that I had a couple of physical books with me. I didn't end up finishing either of them. It was just too inconvenient to lug them around. So some point I'll get to them, but don't be surprised when I don't talk about either of those. I think in this first video, I'm going to talk about the nonfiction that I went through, none of which I thought was particularly outstanding. The first book that I read, which was actually right before I traveled, I realized the library book was due and I wanted to get it back before I went away, was Babel, Around the World in 20 Languages. This, as it says, looks at 20 of the most commonly spoken languages in the world and doesn't necessarily describe all of them, which is what I was expecting. I was expecting something that is more cohesive and had similar facts for the various languages. Instead, what it is some of them are descriptive of the language. The Vietnamese chapter discussed tones in part and other language features, whereas other chapters didn't discuss the same thing at all. So for example, the chapter on Turkish was about how the language was modernized between the 20s and the 60s. The chapter on Tamil was about South Indian scripts. Some of the other chapters were about language spread. So while those are all interesting facts on their own, it's not a particularly cohesive whole. If this were the kind of book that was originally published in a different form, a series of articles or as blog posts or something similar to that, that would be understandable. But this was conceived as a book, so it doesn't completely work as a package. Now that said, I think if you're a bit of a language buff, but not someone with an educational history in linguistics or languages, I think this is very interesting information and it could easily be enjoyable. As someone who did study in the area, the information wasn't really new enough for me, so I wasn't particularly engaged overall, but I do think it's written in an engaging style. But that said, it's just not cohesive, so I was a bit disappointed in it that way. But to be fair, I don't think I'm really the target market for it. I do think it's entertaining enough. It just was an odd format, I thought. Next up, I read Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Dear Ijeawele, a Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions, which, as the title suggests, is basically a letter of 15 points about raising one's daughter in a feminist or non-gender stereotyped way. It is very short and very straightforward, so I don't know how much I can say about it. You wouldn't approach this as anything other than a basically Feminism 101 within the framework of child rearing, but if you're looking for something deeper, that's not what this is. It's the kind of piece that I don't have a lot to say about because it's trying to do one fairly simple thing and does that successfully, but because it's one simple thing, there's not a lot to dig down into it. So yeah, there it was. It made the rounds on BookTube, so I know a lot of people have checked that out. Another very short piece that I read was Vivek Shraya's I'm Afraid of Men. I had really liked Shraya's collection of poetry, Even This Page is White, when I read that a little over a year ago. And I think this is a book that, similarly to the last one, is so short and so straightforward that it's difficult to talk about because it's successful, but it's not trying to do very much. So it would be difficult not to succeed at that. Although having said that, maybe I'm giving other writers too much credit, and maybe that's not true. But this is basically a look at gendered violence. Some of it is specific to Shraya's own experience as a trans woman, and specifically growing up in Edmonton and being visibly South Asian, and the interactions of those three things in creating very specific social situations, which is interesting, but because of the format, and again, this is basically more of an article than... And taken as an article, I think this would be brilliant. Because it's formatted in the style of a book, I was expecting something more, which maybe I shouldn't have, because I did see Laura Fry talk about this in one of her wrap-ups a month or two ago, and if I can find her review, I will link to it. But she basically asked the question why this is formatted as a book as opposed to as an article, and that's probably a good question, because if I were approaching this as
an article, I feel like I would have come away more impressed, whereas because of the way in which it was published and presented, I was expecting something more, and I don't think the intention is to do something more. So that's unfair of me to be critical for that, I think. Yeah, a bit of a dilemma in terms of the format creating unrealistic expectations there, I think. And finally, I read From Here to Eternity, Traveling the World to Find the Good Death by Doughty, who is the YouTuber behind Ask a Mortician. A couple of years ago, I read her memoir of her first few years in the death industry, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, and I was very impressed with that. And I'd heard good things about this one, so I was looking forward to it. But surprisingly, I found this to be a little bit weak. It is basically a travelogue where she goes to a variety of countries, Indonesia, Mexico, Spain, Japan, and looks at death practices and the different ways in which different cultures react to death, deal with death, have funerals, process the dead. The sales feature of her own funeral home is that it is natural, which is in part green, but more than that, philosophically, she's very invested in the living not distancing themselves from death, which is interesting. And in part, what she looks at when she goes around the world is how other cultures don't distance themselves from the dead. Sometimes very literally, in the area of Indonesia she goes to, where people live with their dead, sometimes for years. And sometimes more figuratively, when she's in Japan, she's looking at urns that are kept in very high-tech vaults where people can interact with the systems in which their dead relatives are held, which is all very interesting. It's not really explored at any great depth. It's mostly presented as a different from what she perceives as the Western view of death, which I don't think is completely accurate. I mentioned this a bit when I talked about her memoir, which is that her perception of people not taking care of their own dead, for example, is not necessarily a Western thing, at least in my experience in Canada and in Belgium, which are obviously Western countries. So a lot of her statements about this is how it happens in the West struck me as being an overgeneralization from what happens in the United States, which can happen, obviously, in other countries, but isn't such a necessity. So a lot of those arguments fell flat to me because I kept thinking, well, that's not a universal Western practice. It's maybe a generally culturally accepted practice in most of the United States, maybe. But I felt like because she was making those broad generalizations, it made me suspicious of what she might be generalizing in the travelogue portions. I also thought that as a travelogue, she didn't have quite the balance of chat to facts in the proportions that I would have preferred, but that's just a matter of taste. I think for some other people this is much more engaging than it was for me. But I just didn't buy into some of the generalizations just because some of them I recognized as not being completely correct. So your mileage may vary on that, but I do admire the work she's doing to make change within the US context. So I probably sound a little bit more critical than I am just because I had such high expectations going into it based on her earlier work. In any case, those are the nonfiction pieces that I read on my trip. I'll be back with the second half of my travel vlog and my nonfiction wrap-ups in a week or so. That's it for now. Ciao.